my name is Patrice. I will be the first person to talk this morning. I have been told I cannot swear, it's too early. So I will try to make this lively. How many of you are familiar with the humanitarian world in general? If you can raise your hand.
Can you repeat the question, please?
How many of you are familiar with the humanitarian world? Okay, a few of you. Okay, so we deploy in emergencies. Sometimes those emergencies are man-made. You have one nice example in the news those days. Sometimes those emergencies are so-called natural. The earthquake in Haiti in 2010, you must be familiar with the earthquake in Nepal in 2015. We have a few tropical cyclones also passing every year in Madagascar and so on. And you might have seen on TV a few of those humanitarian organizations running around distributing food, hygiene kits, water, providing medical care, etc. So this is what we will be spending time talking about today. On this first session is about setting up the scene, on trying to explain what is the relationship between the humanitarian world and data in general, on the challenges we faced in dealing, managing, processing, analyzing all of the data that we have available. Typically, very commonly, a humanitarian organization will first need to assess the needs of the population. It's a complex process. We still really don't know how to do it, how to measure the severity of needs. You know, a lot of debates, especially in the neighboring town in Geneva, a lot of intellectual masturbations regarding how we actually do that. That was not swearing.
Borderline.
Okay.
That's okay.
Okay. I need to revise my benchmarks. On the process for measuring those needs is essentially to go and talk with the population, to ask them questions. You all use a poverty metric to understand if a country is going well or bad. It's a bit the same that we are doing. We are measuring deprivations in basic needs: food, health, protection, education. Leonardo, do I miss some? Nutrition, thank you. Voilà. We have several sectors. We have been breaking down life into 11 of those sectors, actually. And for each of those sectors, we are supposed to gather data. And when we have this data, we are supposed to find a way to measure the severity of needs. And measuring the severity of those needs allows us to identify priorities. Where do we need to intervene? Do we need to go north? Do we need to provide shelter? Do we need to provide food? Do we need to provide water? Which group is the most affected or in need? Are those the internally displaced people in public centers? Are those the host communities, etc.? So it's a process that allows us to better identify who we are dealing with and who we need to serve first. And data is at the center of this process. Collecting the right data on time, regularly updating it, allows us to essentially understand the situation a bit better. Once we have done that, we need to move into designing a humanitarian program. Essentially, it's about finding the best available option to solve a deficiency. It can be specific strategies, promotion campaign, distribution of food, distribution of cash, for instance. Cash is getting big in the humanitarian sector right now. And we need a process to essentially link what we know about the severity of needs on the priorities on the interventions that we will be designing to alleviate the suffering of the population. Once we have our programs, we need to monitor their impact or their success. Are we achieving what we said we would achieve? If I said I would reduce malnutrition by 3%, for instance, I need to collect data to measure how have I been good at achieving what I said I would do. We need this data to report to the donors, to report to the people who are supporting us, and also to report to the community. You can see that in those three processes I have just described, data is important. We have come a long way. I trained in the humanitarian sector for the last 10 years in Geneva. I designed guidance on how to collect data, specifically on needs assessment. I designed methodologies to collect this information in different settings, no conflict, natural disasters, etc. We have come a long way. 5 years ago, I was designing methodologies to talk to key informants. So essentially when we want to gather information, we go to the affected village, we go to the mayor, we go to the head of the health center, and we ask questions. Right now, 5 years after, we are able to do 17,000 household surveys in Somalia. So even in very complex settings, we are able to gather a lot of information. We never had that much information. And we still have problems. We are still struggling enormously in dealing with this information. And this is where I think this day is coming from. Data-friendly space on UNOCHA, the Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, will be presenting today some innovations on some efforts that we have been investing in the last few years to try to make this process a bit easier. We still have a long way to go. There is still an enormous amount of challenges that we need to tackle, but hopefully, with the help of technical people, with the help of technologically savvy individuals, we will be able to make progress on better serve the population. At the end of the day, everything we are doing is just to be able to give the right thing at the right person and at the right moment. I would hope that we will get better at this. And for me, one of the key of making this better is essentially to invest in technology that would allow us to more regularly, more appropriately, more accurately understand the humanitarian situation, including the needs of the population and the operational environment we operate in. And on those words, I will give my mic to Leonardo. Perhaps I should say as an introduction, I see a divide right now between quantitative and qualitative people. Basically the Excel people and the Word people, if you want to put it this way. We love, in the literature, everybody has been highlighting this challenge for years. It's real. It's a real problem. What we will be discussing today is about a solution for dealing with quantitative data. This will be Leonardo explaining his experience working in the Humanitarian Center for Data in La Hague, on the solution for dealing with qualitative data. And Ewan will be talking about the DEEP initiative. Hopefully, at some point, those two initiatives will really be put together so we can finally understand better what's happening on the ground and design interventions which are alleviating the needs of those that suffer the most. Over to you.
Thanks, and welcome everyone. I'll keep it short because then I think it would be nice then to really have an exchange and also have time for questions. As Patrice said, there's a lot of information that is already produced. Data is collected. We have surveys going on, and we have more and more sources that we are tapping into. And actually, to address some of these challenges, we started this journey already in 2014 at the Center for Humanitarian Data to provide services to humanitarians to really improve their operations and to improve decision-making based on the best evidence available. So the first challenge was that information was there, but it was hard to find. So if you were looking, let's say, for data on displacement, you had to go on the database of IOM, the International Organization for Migration, or UNHCR, the refugee agency, and then find the data and then understand the format and so on. The first thing we did that actually became sort of like the standard is creating a data sharing platform that is called HDX, the Humanitarian Data Exchange. That is now really like the one-stop shop for humanitarian data. So it's, we have more than 1,000 organizations, constantly sharing data, updating the information they produce, and also, more than 100,000 unique users every month. So this is really becoming, this is just signaling a need and a growing interest in making use of data in the sector. The second challenge was about standards. How do you take the data collected from one organization and from another organization, how do you match them? How do you make sure that the definitions are the same? And we're doing a lot of work in this sense. One example is, a very simple tool that we have created that is called the Humanitarian Language Exchange, so that if organization A is collecting data on food security, but is calling, like the indicators in the given way, and organization B is collecting the same data, but is calling it differently, we have a way to match them, and we have standards on how to call, the different inputs we are collecting. And this is really like, if you end up, working with humanitarian data, most likely you will end up on HDX. The second challenge, and I see that there's going to be a session today, is that once information is available, we are still working in a very challenging context, and the quality is critical, and and usually there are gaps in the information we have, but also in the quality that is, sometimes, not ideal, or let's say the data that we may be collecting is not fully representative, because again, we may not have access to a given region, or we may have biases in the way we're collecting data. So a big issue, and is going to be discussed extensively, is how do we minimize the risks, in just relying on the data that is collected in the field to take decisions. So this is, the broader field of data responsibility that also looks into, how do we manage, share, collect, store data in a responsible way, in an ethical way, and how do we, minimize the ethical risks, related to the use of data in the sector. The third thing that I would like, also to mention is that usually humanitarians don't like data. So, and I think it's very important, especially for the people in the field. I mean, it's not just their priority to do analysis, or really like to, maybe start looking at doing all the analysis that we, that we may be interested in. So, and usually because they don't necessarily see the importance and the value of investing in analytics. And so one big priority for the Center for Humanitarian Data is just, about doing this capacity building and, upskilling, if you want, humanitarians, so that they can also be able to do, some simple analysis that may be useful for their work. And then, we're talking about sort of like, how do we collect data, and we get an assessment of what is the situation, how do we get a better sense of what is going on. There's a lot going on also about trying to be more proactive and try to anticipate things and humanitarian needs that are likely to happen. If you look at the humanitarian system, I mean, for most of the crises, especially those that Patrice mentioned that are related to natural hazards, the UN keeps responding, and humanitarians keeps responding to the same shocks. We're talking about typhoons in the Philippines, and we know that they're coming. We know that there are regular cholera outbreaks in Mozambique and in DRC, and we know that there are floods in Nepal and Bangladesh happening every year. So how do we transition from a system that is not just responding to humanitarian needs, and is, the humanitarian system is extremely fast and efficient in, very quickly putting in place the processes and the interventions to address humanitarian needs, but how do we get better at anticipating needs, for those shocks that we can, of course, foresee, and put in place actions aimed at mitigating those needs. So I would say, and just to conclude and maybe leave the floor to Ewan. So there's definitely growing interest in, using data in the humanitarian sector, but the challenges and the gaps are extremely relevant, and, are many times the main blocker you really like for doing meaningful and reliable analysis. So that's why, what we're discussing today, really like tapping into and investing in technologies and better tools to extract also, data from non-conventional sources, or being more efficient in extracting information is critical. So maybe with this, over to you, Ewan.
Oh, there we go. It's okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. So as Patrice and Leonardo mentioned, we in the humanitarian community work a lot with both quantitative and qualitative data. Before I start, we've talked about quantitative data. Does anyone have any ideas on what qualitative data may be, and any examples that you can think of? Feel free to shout it out. News articles, that's a good one. What else? Survey comments, that's a good one. Any more? Transcriptions of conversations, also a good one. Me talking right now, this is generally qualitative. And in the humanitarian community, there's really a broad range of qualitative data sources. News articles are certainly a very popular one, both in international publications like BBC, Guardian, New York Times, but also in local news sources in countries where humanitarian crises are responding, either in English or in a local language. One thing that's really important about this qualitative data is that it has lots of really meaningful and interesting information that can be helpful to inform humanitarian responders when they're undertaking their work. But the problem is that as opposed to quantitative information where it's generally tabular and machine readable, of course there's pre-processing and there's cleaning that needs to happen, but it's already structured. And then from there you can start to do things like develop models, like Leonardo said, in order to start predicting and working in a more anticipatory manner. The flip side is really hard for qualitative because it's all text. And in order to extract and work on that text, you of course need to either go through it all manually, or you need to use NLP and machine learning processes to do it, or potentially a combination of both. In order to set the scene a bit for where we are now, I think it's helpful to go back a little bit and touch briefly on the situation that brought me starting to work in the humanitarian community. In 2015, I responded to the Nepal earthquakes, and I was working with Ewan, the organization Leonardo works with, and a few other organizations in assessing the situation of the humanitarian community's response. And so essentially you had a large group of people that were looking at whatever information we could get our hands on in order to understand which parts of the country were most badly impacted by the earthquake, and then what the specific needs were. So it could be that, if roads had been cut off, then transportation becomes really difficult, or if a water supply had cut off, then particular areas would be in need of water assistance. And in order to do that, there are a number of tools that are used. As Patrice mentioned, surveys are very popular, so going from household to household and asking what people's needs are, or talking to a key informant. But another one is looking at data that's already present in qualitative sources. So in the initial days after a humanitarian crisis, such as an earthquake, a lot of qualitative data comes from local news sources, and it comes from social media, and it comes from word of mouth. And then as a humanitarian crisis progresses, and as time goes from the initial shock, which would be an earthquake or a flood, more and more sort of formal data becomes available, be it from reports from humanitarian organizations or elsewhere. And throughout this whole curve, you have a wide variety of qualitative data that again has lots of nuggets of information that you need to extract. So when I was in Nepal, what we were doing is we had a team of international humanitarian workers that were going through a lot of the reports that were coming from humanitarian organizations, and we had a team of Nepalis who could speak local languages, and they were going through social media and other news sources, picking out information. So it could be a sentence that would say, in this particular region, 42 people have been injured, and 55 are in acute need of nutritional support, let's say. And so what we would do is take this information and then put it into somewhat of a standardized spreadsheet or tool, and just do this on repeat in order to start to get a better sense of what's happening. So really the idea is to take qualitative data and almost quantify it or make it tabular. And by doing so, you can really start to merge these two worlds, because there's a lot of really rich information in both qualitative and quantitative data. But the problem is really just finding a way to bring them together so that you can kind of get a better complete picture of what's going on. At the time when we were working in Nepal, we didn't really have any standardized tooling for doing this, in this process of going through qualitative data and annotated information, which is where DEEP came out of. And you can see all the little characters we have behind here. One thing we did recently was, of course, make a cool logo set of the DEEP Kraken mascot doing some exciting things. So if you go on the platform, he's all over there. And so we started working on DEEP with the idea of building a platform that would allow humanitarian analysts to ingest qualitative data, so news reports, PDF reports from humanitarian organizations, and annotate it and extract information in standardized methodologies. So as Patrice mentioned, the humanitarian community has lots of ways to define things that are going on. And in some ways, it's really prescriptive and it's really closely defined for individual organizations. But within DEEP, you can use these standardized ways of extracting information. So you take that piece of text that says X number of people are in need of food support, and then you would then annotate it in a common framework. So in a nutshell, that's what the platform does. It allows you to source information, annotate it, and then export it and analyze it. And as we've gone through this process of building DEEP over the past 7 years, one thing that's become painfully obvious is that it's a really tedious process to do this annotation, and it takes a really long time. Right now, it's all human annotators that do it, and we have teams of people that just spend most of their day just reading through documents and doing this somewhat routine process of taking text and annotating it. While this produces good results, it's timely, and it can also be quite costly to have to pay people to do this. So while we're here at a machine learning conference, we've really been focusing in the past year and a half on developing natural language processing tools that will help us through this process of using DEEP. And with the ultimate idea of reducing the amount of time that it takes to do this and increasing the accuracy of the annotations and also the consistency. So if you imagine, there's a few steps to doing this whole process. First is sourcing data, then annotating it, and then exporting it. And all of these take a lot of time individually, but each one you can save quite a lot of time by using NLP. I think the first step that we'll have is excuse me, is a human in the loop process where we'll start to recommend suggestions to users about how text should be annotated or what sources to ingest, and then eventually we'll move towards things that are more automated. As someone with a technical background, what's quite interesting is that we're not necessarily designing novel algorithms or having very advanced NLP breakthroughs. What we're really doing is just using existing methodologies, fine-tuning them, and then applying them to a specific domain, which is the humanitarian community. In general, the humanitarian community isn't particularly a hotbed for machine learning and artificial intelligence, so it's quite interesting to do this work when there's not too many other people doing it. So for those who have an interest, I would certainly encourage you to chat with us and see how you may want to get involved, because I find it quite rewarding to work in a domain that is the output of the work you feel like goes towards some greater social good. So what we'll be talking about today is the NLP work that we've done, how it works, both from a technical standpoint and then an overall standpoint, and then in the future, what we'll be building towards. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and open it up for any questions.
I have one for them. Okay. This is, I mean, investing in new technologies and, saving time and making the work is, is really exciting. But usually we have seen that the adoption of these tools is as important as the quality and the technology itself. So, and, what's the main, can you talk about, how do you invest, or how do you convince end users in, how do you build trust around these new tools, and what's the approach that the DP is taking?
Do you want to do it?
First, we have some normative ways. We are like any other sectors. We have guidance. We have gods who are deciding in New York how things are supposed to be and how things are supposed to be done. And in all of those guidance, since 12 years, it is written, you shall deal with secondary data when you are trying to understand the humanitarian situation. So in the Bible, it's written, you have to do it. So that's good. That's actually a normative way to enforce an activity. Second, we have some humanitarian sectors, I was mentioning nutrition, food security, protection, and so on, who are inherently qualitative. This is what they are. Protection, I call them the lawyers who don't know how to count. They deal with reports. They don't deal with Excel spreadsheet. It's coming actually, and they are starting, but they are moving from the qualitative world to the quantitative world. You have the food security people who are extremely quantitative and who nearly never deal with the qualitative data. Those two worlds are right now collapsing. In every good research cycle, you are supposed to deal with the best of best world. The problem in the humanitarian sector is that we don't have the skills who are able to jump from one to the other. So if you send, we have information management officers who are humanitarian staff who are purely dedicated to deal with information. And historically, those are GIS people and geographical information systems, and people who can build dashboards in Power BI, etc. It's a bit more complicated than that, but this is essentially the caricature of it. If you give 25 reports written by hand to analyze to those people, they will say, this does not fit in my Excel spreadsheet. So you need other people. Those other people are here. They don't always communicate. What we don't have right now is a way to bring together those two things. And this will take time, in my opinion. But going back to your original question, which is how do you ensure that people are taking it? Some sectors traditionally are much more prone to use qualitative data than some others. We see some movements now where each of those worlds are starting to look in the garden of the other, saying, there is some interesting stuff here. I should probably have a look because this will definitively increase the accuracy of my conclusions.
One other thing to add that has surprised me as I've gone through my career in the humanitarian community is that just because you have a really interesting system that can do something cool doesn't mean that it's going to get used. And I think this is, I mentioned this yesterday if anyone saw me talking as well, which was there's a lot of really interesting contributions from the private sector and hackathons and things like that, and also initiatives that organizations pay for, which gets developed but then not ultimately used. And so it's all good and well, but I think in order for humanitarian organizations to really take advantage of machine learning, NLP, AI, et cetera, it has to be adopted. I think a lot of that is just an organizational mindset in that it has to be a priority for organizations to actually want to use this, and that requires funding, and it requires time, and it requires effort. So I don't really know if I have a magical solution for it. I think we've been going for about 7 years at this point on Deep, and we've come pretty far, but at the same time, I feel like it's a real slog and everything takes a very long time. So it's definitely a labor of love in order to work in this little sliver of a niche in the humanitarian community that we work in. Thanks for the question. Any other questions from the audience?
First of all, thank you so much for all this really interesting work, and thank you for all that you've done. Well, what I was thinking about when wondering for a question I could ask was whether adding to this ability to work with what you have as reports, as all the information you can gather to extract some annotation that could be useful, do you also share some guidance with the people that you can work with on the local grounds to what they could document, to what they could provide you to simplify your works? Or are you expecting to always work with what you will get, given that a situation could surprise you at the end of the day?
So it's a bit what Leonardo was saying before. First of all, we are trying to measure the same thing since Henri Dunant. So since more than 200 years, basically, we are doing the same thing. So it's our opportunity here. At some point, you know, in the expertise cycle, you start to see patterns, and you start to say, this information is interesting, this one is not. So that's the first thing. We have a corpus of humanitarian information that we know we are interested about. We want information about impact, about needs, about response, about priorities, about coping mechanisms, and so on. So this is our chance here. We are always trying to find the same type of information. And this is, in my opinion, what led to this, to the success of the NLP initiative in the deep. Second, we also understand how information is being generated in a humanitarian crisis. I'm following Ukraine right now. I know that for now, there is zero information on humanitarian needs. Okay, it's all about conflict events, military movements, casualties, dead, missing people, perhaps. But we are not even looking at an information on coping mechanism, you know, the strategy that people are adopting when they are trying to face a deficiency, because this information will be there in 3 weeks from now. Right now, what we have to deal with is tweets. Tweets allowing to identify where there have been some casualties, etc. Dealing with social media is one thing. This is what I call an atomic level information. It's one person somewhere sending a photo, doing a report, and you will have to have an entire team behind you to verify this information. If you are doing some daily report, the tweets from yesterday, they will be in the newspaper tomorrow. Okay, so you can choose. Do you want to do you want to invest 35 people looking at tweets every day, or do you want to wait for the day after that this information has been curated by other people and ends up in a newspaper? So yeah, I think we understand pretty well how information is flowing in a humanitarian crisis. For the first month of the Ukraine operation, to understand what is the level of response in Ukraine, I need to go in every humanitarian organization website, because they are communicating about what they are doing. It's huge. There is 500, 600 of them probably intervening now in Ukraine. Last week, on Friday, UNOCHA produced the first 3W, which is a document mapping where there is humanitarian presence. It took 1 month to get it. But as soon as this document is available, and I know it will remain available and be regularly updated for the next year, probably, I don't have to look at the humanitarian organization's website anymore. So all of this is flowing, is going pretty fast. Fortunately, with experience, we understand a bit how this is happening, how this is going, and we can refine our strategies, we can refine our sources or select better sources just because we know that some other people are doing a better job at capturing stuff. If you want to follow the conflict itself today in Ukraine, you have two choices: the tweets, okay, or you wait at the end of the day at 3 p.m. The Institute of Study of War is publishing a brief on the conflict developments in Ukraine. So you see, it's one thing is to have 30 people working on curating information. The other thing is to wait 3 o'clock and to wait for the guy who is doing his job well and who is providing the summary that you need for your work. So yeah, it's mapping the information landscape and adapting your strategies is actually pretty important, and it will be changing in the next 3 months. It will be changing a lot. Last week, I saw the first comprehensive assessment reports in Ukraine. It's the first one. We are 1 month after the start of the crisis. It's the first one. In the next 2 weeks, there will be an explosion of information in Ukraine. When I say an explosion, we are not ready to face it. This will be a shit show. And then I'm between my team and Ewan's team, we probably have 15 people working on the crisis right now to try to understand what's happening and to report on it. We are effed. Yeah? How many times?
That was good. You can say it.
Yeah, so we are not ready for what's coming to us in terms of information, especially for a very mediatic crisis as this one. A lot of people are reporting there is not enough resources in the humanitarian world right now to essentially understand what's happening and reporting on the situation in a regular way. We are not enough. It's simply too big for all of us. And this is where technology is coming in my opinion, and can help us making the right choices. I don't believe in a technology that would provide us with the report automatically. I don't believe in it. I'm skeptic about that. I believe that the right use of brain power on technology can make a huge difference. I believe that if you are too optimistic, you fall in other traps, and then you probably have to get back. So it's a slow process, as Leonardo was saying. We are making progress. I believe that the NLP system in DEEP is not revolutionary, but is a key piece of information. An analyst right now in the humanitarian world will spend 80% of its time collecting information, 10% of its time trying to understand what he has available, and 10% of his time doing other, answering calls, etc. The war, it's a war. The fight for us is reducing the time that you spend collecting information and structuring it, on increasing the time that you can spend trying to understand what you have.
All right, we got to wrap. Yeah.
So, thank you very much, guys, for this brief introduction. And okay, so we give a little bit of an applause of these three guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.